It is common knowledge that those in power and those who dictate the laws of the land don't always follow those laws themselves. It is also known that those who utilize the powers vested in them do not always do so with innocent intent. On the contrary, abuse of power for selfish indulgences by those in charge has been a fatal flaw of civilizations past and present since time immemorial. These monsters of mankind have left countless lives destroyed in their wake. But perhaps, sometimes, these monsters are simply dreamt up by those who envy or resent others with more power than them, projecting hideous fallacies upon an otherwise flawed figure who doesn't fit the mold. Such an occurrence may have taken place in 17th century Eastern Europe, spinning the troubled tale of Elizabeth Bathory, notoriously known as the Blood Countess, a true horror in history. Born August 7th in the year 1560, Elizabeth Bathory, or Elizabeth Bathory, as the Hungarian pronunciation goes, though don't hold us to that, was part of one of the oldest and wealthiest families in all of Eastern Europe. Her father, George IV, was a Hungarian baron. His brother Andrew Bathory was voivode of Transylvania, the highest position of power. While the family name Bathory didn't rise to significant prominence until the late Middle Ages, their family roots in the Kingdom of Hungary are said to go back to the 12th century, when their ancestors immigrated from Swabia, a region in what is today southwestern Germany. As for Elizabeth's mother, she too held a position of power, being a baroness, her brother Stephen holding many noble titles himself, including the King of Poland. As with many noble families during centuries past, the Bathory family tended to intermarry within the bloodline, which caused its own host of problems, harboring sensitive secrets from those who would otherwise perceive a powerful and virile family of blue-blooded highborns. Many of the Bathorys suffered mental illnesses, along with genetic disorders, a significant one in the family being epilepsy, which Elizabeth and her uncle, King Stephen of Poland, both shared. Within her first 10 years of life, Elizabeth would suffer violent seizures, abrupt mood changes, and crippling migraines. A common treatment for epilepsy during the time was largely ineffective and definitely morose. The blood of a non-epileptic would be smeared on the patient's lips, with more aggressive forms of treatment being the patient actually consuming a non-epileptic's blood, along with ground portions of their skull. A macabre practice that some have suggested may have influenced some of the noblewoman's dark behavior later in life. By the early 1500s, Hungary's borders had become ever more fortified due to increasing invasions from the Ottoman Turks. But defenses and stately stability were failing due to neglect by a weakened monarchy, leading to bloody peasant revolts. Turkish forces began to spread out across eastern and central Hungary, while 2 kings attempted to share the crown, and it was one of these kings, Ferdinand I, who would ultimately take sole reign over Hungary, bringing the kingdom into his own family empire, the Habsburgs, a lineage that would rule the country until the early 19th century. So effectively, during Elizabeth's time, Hungary was split into 3 sections: the Habsburg Empire in the west, Royal Hungary in the middle, and the Ottoman-controlled Hungary towards the east. Because of Elizabeth's power as a noblewoman, she was expected to attend and learn from many royal engagements. With Hungary at war with the Ottomans, conditions often presented her with many violent spectacles, including one in which she was allowed to witness the execution of a nomadic man who was accused of stealing and sewn into the suffocating stomach of a horse. She was also witness to numerous beatings and other cruel mistreatments of peasant servants, as during the time, Hungarian nobility were prone to casual torture and murder against the peasant population to deter any further revolts. As for more docile parts of her childhood, being part of such a rich and influential family, and the Renaissance in full swing throughout Europe, Elizabeth was well educated, and from an early age she was proficient, if not fluent, in the Hungarian, Slovak, Greek, Latin, and German languages. Along with her intellect, she began to mature into a beautiful young girl, and so around the age of 10, she was engaged to Ferenc Nadasdy, 5 years her senior, cousin to her mother Anna, his own family also highly influential and wealthy. Elizabeth was moved from her home in Erbeter and set up in Kakitse Castle, one of the most Gothic structures in Hungary at the time, nestled amongst the peaks of the Carpathian Mountains. Here, the young countess would learn from her mother-in-law the ins and outs of managing the family estates. Her husband, Count Ferenc, was a distinguished soldier dubbed the Black Knight of Hungary, who had little time for domestic pursuits as he was often away fighting the Ottomans abroad. However, as part of a housewarming gift, the Count is said to have constructed a torture chamber, being that he and Elizabeth enjoyed each other's company in such a place. Ferenc supposedly even demonstrating new torture techniques for Elizabeth, such as sticking rolled oiled papers between the toes of servant girls before lighting them on fire to burn their feet. He even gifted his young bride with a spiked glove to use against disobedient servants. As her life at the castle became more involved as its new countess, whether through isolation, pressure from her duties, family genetics, childhood experiences, or all of the above, her appetite for violence grew. In 1593, the Ottomans launched a new campaign against Hungary, invading into the center of the kingdom and taking a number of towns. This threatened to stretch the boundaries of conflict between the Christian Habsburg Empire and the Muslim Ottoman Turks. Because of this, Elizabeth's husband spent more time away from home. It was during this time, in what would come to be known by many as the Long War, that Elizabeth is said to have done much traveling, visiting with family, including an aunt who introduced her niece to an eclectic group of people, the likes of alchemists, occultists, and rumored witches. A devout Protestant Christian, Elizabeth would nonetheless become fascinated, and some would say obsessed, with the dark arts. In 16th century Christian Hungary, the company the Countess kept would earn her nicknames through society, such as the Beast of Kakice. It is around this time that she is thought to have begun sadistically torturing her servants. Then, in 1601, a strange woman, known only as Anna de Volia, entered the castle as one of the Countess's new servants, the two quickly forming a close and dark relationship, both sharing an impeccable interest in violence. Over a decade of fighting new battles against the Turks, Ferenc Nadasdy, the Black Knight of Hungary, died. It is only known that it was a sudden mysterious illness while he was deployed on the front lines. Some have suspected it was a terminal case of cholera. This left Elizabeth Bathory a widow, single mother to 4 children, and the new head of perhaps the wealthiest and most powerful estate in the kingdom, next to the Habsburg Empire, of course. Though during the most intense fighting in the Hungarian-Ottoman Wars, the power couple that was Elizabeth and the Black Knight reportedly bequeathed military funding to the empire to further fuel the war against the Turks and keep the domestic economy stabilized. Following her husband's death in 1604, Elizabeth was becoming a different sort of countess. During future testimonies about her crimes, witnesses would note that once the woman, Anna Darvulia, entered the castle, Elizabeth became crueler. She had already exacted extreme punishment on her servants, reportedly for the slightest of mistakes or disobediences. In addition, the Countess had established her own hospital, as cholera and plague swept through the region often. Some would say this act of benevolence would prove Elizabeth to care for her subjects, while others would state that it was simply an alibi, a constant supply of low-born victims for the noblewoman to amuse herself with. Suspicions grew when clerics were repeatedly called to Kakice to perform burial rites for more and more of Bathory's servant maids, said to have simply died of cholera, or for unknown reasons. Again, even though it was not unusual for a noble to simply kill a peasant, the excessive death toll at the Bathory-Nadasdy estates created questions. Elizabeth's inner circle would include the aforementioned Anna Darvulia, a teenage male servant named Fishko, along with her maids, Ilona, Dorka, and Catalin, and a rumored witch that visited the castle often. It would be through this odd council that horrific punishment was allegedly served to hundreds of low-class servant girls, often quite young, between the ages of 10 and 14. Girls would be stripped and lashed with stinging nettles, soaked in an ice bath before being left outdoors in the winter to freeze, branded with hot irons, perforated with needles, their fingers clipped off with scissors, and their bodies beaten. Deceased servants were said to be dispatched outside the castle walls to be devoured by the many European wolves that roamed the lands. The Countess was alleged to have even bitten a piece of flesh from a servant girl's face. Other extreme details include that she was in possession of an iron maiden, a metal coffin-like device with sharp spikes protruding inward from its interior, the victim being shut inside to slowly die an agonizing death. One method of torture and execution also said to have been performed at Kakitse was covering a victim in honey and tying them up outside to be slowly devoured by insects. It is not certain if this is something Elizabeth herself had done, or if it was a preferred method of her late husband, Ferris. Whatever the case, hundreds of servant girls were said to go into the Countess's service and never be seen again, unless it was their corpse being discovered in the forest below the castle, or laid to rest in a nearby cemetery. This was a curious, if not troubling, pattern noticed of Hungary's most powerful woman, who was also successfully holding the Turks back from further conquest of the kingdom. However, while many contemporaries may have seen such wanton violence towards the lower class as extremely lowbrow behavior coming from a noble, it was of little concern, legally speaking. That is until young noblewomen also began to go missing around the castle. By 1609, Elizabeth is thought to have spiraled into a lonely, isolated life at Kakitse. Her children grown and living abroad, her husband dead for years, and debts of the Deranged Bathory estate mounting. The Countess then made a truly perplexing decision. Having spent years allegedly torturing and dispatching hundreds of peasant servant girls, her focus turned towards those within her own class. It is not known exactly why the Countess set her sights on new victims belonging to the nobility, but it coincided with the opening of a girls' school at Kakitse, a place for young noblewomen to learn courtly etiquette and other noble duties from the most powerful woman in Hungary. However, when even these untouchable young noblewomen began to turn up missing or dead, the families began to demand answers. So, once word of these deaths and disappearances of nobles at Kakitse reached the ears of Matthias II, King of Hungary, an investigation was ordered. King Matthias tasked Georg Thurzo, cousin to Elizabeth and a high-ranking count in Hungary, with leading the investigation. Thurzo traveled to the villages surrounding Kakitse and heard the witness testimonies and rumors that swirled about the castle like a black omen. Although, there are other elements thought to be at play for Thurzo's motivations, elements almost entirely political and self-ingratiating in nature. When Elizabeth's husband, Ferenc, died, she refused, to the shock of many, to remarry, instead taking the reign of her late husband's lands and coffers into her own hands, something quite frowned upon, even in Renaissance Hungary. Furthermore, the rumors of witchcraft were reason enough for investigation, and in addition, the allegation of Elizabeth, a woman, possessing her very own printing press, was thought to be too radical a concept for patriarchal rulers to abide. These concerns, in addition to Elizabeth's own relatives voraciously circling her wealth and influence, are thought to have been deciding factors in her arrest. So, in late December 1610, during a holiday feast, Thurzo arrived at Kakitse with soldiers and arrested the Countess, along with her inner circle of servants. There would be no trial for the Countess, given the allegations of murdered nobility at her hands. Thurzo had produced for the court the body of a young girl, deceased, who he claimed the Countess had murdered, and presented a live but injured girl he claimed to have witnessed the Countess torturing during her arrest. However, it is believed this may have been fabricated evidence, and that it was more likely that Thurzo simply interrupted a quiet Christmas feast at the castle. Either way, Elizabeth was barred from the public, and Thurzo led a public prosecution hearing, wherein 300 witnesses, many related to Thurzo, were gathered and testified to her crimes, along with testimonies taken from her servant accomplices, who confessed they tortured many girls under the directive of their Countess. Though it's important to note that these confessions were drawn out, ironically, through torture, heavily bringing into question the veracity of these claims. Nevertheless, in the first weeks of 1611, Elizabeth's most trusted servants who supposedly meted out brutal punishments and outright murder on the servants of Kakitse were swiftly executed, only one being spared to spend life in prison. As for Elizabeth Bathory, instead of imprisonment or execution, her family won over King Matthias and deferring her punishment to house arrest, in exchange for expunging any debts owed to the family by the crown. Though the Countess was not to be given free rein of her home, instead, like some pitiful beast longing to be forgotten, she was confined to one room of her castle, the doorway walled in with bricks, leaving just enough space for food to be slid through. And there, Elizabeth Bathory would stay for the remainder of her life, until one day in 1614, she complained to a guard that her hands felt quite cold. Her complaint fell on deaf ears, and later that night, Elizabeth Bathory died in solitary confinement, aged 54. Today, retrospective studies by scholars into the life of Elizabeth Bathory has revealed that at least some of the more monstrous crimes of the Countess were most likely fabrications for leverage against a powerful yet isolated woman in early modern Hungary. One of the more infamous crimes, often mythologized in films, books, video games, and other media, was her penchant for draining the blood from her victims to collect and bathe in, a sadistically depraved beauty routine to retain her youth. Though testifying witnesses who served in Kakitse detailed having to often clean blood from the floors of her torture chambers, suggesting there was no attempt at preservation, and none ever made mention of any literal bloodbaths being drawn for the Countess. Though enough evidence does exist to support the Countess's lack of total innocence, including a letter written by a local priest in 1602, detailing she and her husband's excessive cruelty toward their servants, and the observations of clergy members tending to the consecration of deceased girls, noting signs of abuse on their bodies. For all intents and purposes, the dark and complex case of Elizabeth Bathory, who is still to this day named in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most prolific female serial killer in history, could be construed as a tale with two sides. Yes, the young noblewoman who grew up during a time of war, social upheaval, and normalized violence against those beneath her station, likely committed murders and subjected her subjects to some level of torture. But evidence also supports that she was preyed upon by her constituents, who saw her lonely place at the top of power and her unseemly behavior as a countess to be the perfect scenario to exploit for personal gain. So, in this criminal case of serial murder from early modern Hungary, monsters appear to have inhabited both sides of the law, leading to the downfall of a once respectable woman of nobility and the enrichment of those who would build their success atop her bones, making the tale of Elizabeth Bathory, the so-called Blood Countess, a true horror in history. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please consider subscribing today. And if you have any shocking or scary stories from history you would like to see covered on the channel, feel free to let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching Horrors in History.